welcome back to my channel. I just fancied doing a video today because I recently read an article in Nature magazine online, which I thought was very interesting. I came across it on Twitter and then I read the article. It's quite scholarly and scientific, so I skipped parts of it because a lot of the scientific bit is kind of a lot of I don't know, jargon and stuff. So I just made notes basically on the bits that were most interesting, like the sort of gist of the article, really, the most important points. So the article I'm referring to, it's entitled, so you can Google it if you want to, Polygenic, is that how you pronounce it? Polygenic, I think, actually. Polygenic and developmental profiles of autism differ by age of diagnosis. So this article is in nature.com and it was published in October 2025, so very recently. So I'm just going to read to you the notes I took down, really, which are kind of direct from the article, and I also would like to share some of my own views as well. This may well take more than a couple of videos, we'll just see how we get on. So, the crux of it is that there's been research that has been carried out that demonstrates that there are two different socio-emotional and behavioural trajectories that are associated with the age of autism diagnosis. Common genetic variants account for 11% of variance in age at diagnosis. Similar to the contribution of individual socio-demographic and clinical factors, which explain less than 15% of variance. The polygenic architecture of autism can be broken down into two genetically correlated autism polygenic factors. One of these factors is associated with earlier autism diagnosis and lower social and communication abilities in early childhood, but only moderately genetically correlated with ADHD and mental health conditions. The second factor is associated with a later autism diagnosis and increased socio-emotional and behavioural difficulties in adolescence, and has a moderate to high positive genetic correlation with ADHD and mental health conditions. There is a growing recognition that the behavioural signs of autism may not manifest clearly in the first 3 years of life, as a greater proportion are now receiving a diagnosis from mid-childhood and later than in early childhood. My own thoughts on that one, of course. Well, I've got a few thoughts on that. For example, how do we tease apart those people who did have very clear and obvious signs in the first 3 years of life, but who didn't receive a diagnosis later because of very long waiting lists, or other reasons? There's a lot of other reasons as well. Is this to do with carer concerns? Because after all, parents may well have concerns in the first 3 years of life, but might not do anything about them, or they might kind of like be in denial about them, or put them to one side, even though they do have a lot of concerns, but they, for whatever reason, don't decide to pursue them for whatever reason. So is this to do with parents' concerns, or is this to do with, what's going on here? Is it the case that in some cases parents don't have any concerns in the first 3 years, or is it the case that their parents do have concerns, but for whatever reason don't take it further, or other reasons that delay the diagnosis? So some questions going on there at the back of my mind. So next point now. So some studies have demonstrated that there's a subset of children who do not initially meet the criteria for autism, but receive the diagnosis later on. Maybe that's because, I don't know, it can sometimes be quite difficult to diagnose autism in very young children, maybe because not all of the features are necessarily apparent yet. And sometimes a child has to develop a bit before those signs maybe become a bit more evident in some cases. Later diagnosis is associated with elevated occurring mental health conditions, and it listed conditions such as depression, PTSD, anorexia, those sort of things. It didn't mention OCD, interestingly. I don't have any of the mental health conditions it mentioned. I don't have depression, I don't have those ones, I have OCD and anxiety. But it didn't mention those, it just mentioned those other ones. I think it's about 6 mental health conditions that it mentioned. Previous studies have shown that individual clinical and socio-demographic factors explain only a small proportion of the variance in age at diagnosis. So, there could well be genetic differences for contributing age at diagnosis, and that's what this study was looking at. 2 models can explain how genetics affect the age of diagnosis. The first model, and this is the one that's the traditional model. So the traditional model is that autism has a single polygenic etiology with the same set of genetic variants, common variants, underlying autism, regardless of the age of diagnosis. This is known as the unitary model. In this model, later diagnosed autism may have subtle clinical features that are harder to recognise early in life, perhaps because there's a lower genetic predisposition to autism. So this is the idea that there's the same underlying genetic kind of inheritance pattern, but all that differs is the number of these genes that the person carries, which would then potentially determine the severity of their autism and potentially gauge at which they're diagnosed. That's been known as the unitary model, and that has been the kind of most traditional accepted model, essentially saying there's one cause of autism, there's one genetic polygenic kind of etiology. It just depends on how many of these genes are inherited and the intensity of their expression, which will then determine the age in which the autism is diagnosed. This, by the way, this doesn't talk about de novo mutations, because some types of autism are actually caused by de novo mutations, in other words, mutations that are not inherited from either parent. It doesn't talk about that. It mentioned that in its study. It said it's not talking about that. That's because it didn't have. So that is outside of this study. It's just looking at the common genetic variation, which is the vast majority of autism is caused by these common genetic variants. So as a person gets older, environmental factors may alter their clinical features. This is the unitary model, by the way. The idea that as they get older, environment may alter the features, bringing them above the clinical threshold, which might then mean it'd be a reason why some of these people get a later diagnosis. But the second model, and it's the one that this study was looking at, is that earlier and later autism diagnoses have different underlying developmental trajectories and polygenic etiologies. So essentially they're two different types of autism, potentially. And this is known as the developmental model. And this implies that there are different sets of genetic variants associated with early and later diagnosis. And existing evidence shows that genetic influences on traits can vary across development. Okay. So yes, that's known as the developmental model, which suggests there are two distinct groups of autism, which essentially have different genetic architectures and are only very moderately correlated with one another. Okay, so moving over to video number 2 now.